We chose the wrong path. It's not to say that the path we have doesn't work. In fact, there are occasions when, it does work. You occasionally need maybe a drug on serious conditions, but not to rely on that as a lifestyle system of treating people with illness. And I'm basically now making the argument in my lectures and so forth that we've really got to first off understand nutrition. It's a science that's very different from what people have taught and very different from what people have heard. And when we understand that, then we can do amazing things in treating illness. Of course, heart disease has been demonstrated to be able to be reversed quite well. Diabetes you can do the same thing.
Very easy, yeah.
And in our research, one of the things that really got me going in this thing was our ability to turn experimental cancer on and off.
Right.
Hi everyone, Nicolette Richer here, host of the Eat Real to Heal podcast. And I have to start off by saying that this particular podcast today is extremely moving for me. I am here in my office in Whistler, BC, recording the intro to this podcast with Dr. T. Colin Campbell, who I interviewed about a month ago. And the reason that recording this intro is very emotional for me right now is for two reasons. First, Dr. Colin Campbell needs absolutely no introduction in the world of plant-based, whole food, organic, clean eating to be able to prevent, stop, and even reverse cancer and other chronic degenerative diseases. He is legendary for the research and the work that he has done to prove, to show, and to teach that food is in fact medicine. For those who are new to the concept that food is medicine, and for those who've been misled by the medical and the food industry to believe that your diet and the food that you put into your mouth daily does not affect your health, or that it may not be directly linked to the host of chronic health issues that you are battling now. And for those listeners that haven't accessed the hundreds of scientific studies that show that we can turn our genes for cancer and other diseases on and off simply by changing the food that we consume, well, then you may not know who Dr. T. Colin Campbell is, but I am going to dive into his bio shortly. But the other reason why this podcast is so moving and emotional for me is because I was introduced to Dr. Colin Campbell directly through a very, very dear friend of mine, Howard Strauss. And Howard is the grandson of Dr. Max Gerson. And I teach the Gerson therapy. It's something that I've been teaching for the last 11 years. It's the foundation of our businesses, the Green Mustache and Richer Health Retreat Center, and my PhD research. Everything that I've been living and practicing for the last 22 years. Now, one of the very last emails I received from Howard, who has over the past few years become a very dear friend of mine, it was an email where he introduced me to Dr. Colin Campbell and said, I need to get him on the show. And he introduced us, and then voila, here we are recording the intro with Dr. Colin Campbell, a superhero alongside Dr. Max Gerson in my mind and in the minds of so many people. However, a few short weeks ago on June 10th, Howard passed away suddenly. Howard passed away suddenly, leaving thousands of people, including myself and Dr. Colin Campbell, stunned by his sudden death. So it is with great sadness that I record this intro as I'm reminded all too much about Howard and our friendship and all the great things he did in this world to carry on the scientific and proven principles of the Gerson therapy. He was a renegade, just like his mother, Charlotte Gerson, was, and just like Dr. Max Gerson was, and just like Dr. Colin Campbell himself is. However, amidst the sadness of recording this intro, it's also a great joy that I record this intro, because if it wasn't for Howard, I may not have had the opportunity to bring this incredible interview with Dr. Colin Campbell to you at this moment. There's no doubt I would have found a way to interview Dr. Colin Campbell, but it would not have been the same thing as having Howard introduce us directly. Also, this show is a testament to Howard's life, This show is in total honor of Howard and all the brilliant work he did in this world to teach people about food as medicine, and that cancer can be reversed, that chronic diseases of all kinds can be reversed by reversing nutrient deficiencies and by using clean, organic, nutrient-dense food, and by eliminating toxins out of our environment and ultimately directly out of our bodies. Howard Strauss, if by any chance you are out there in this world right now and able to hear this show is for you, my friend. Without further ado, it is a great honor to introduce Dr. T. Colin Campbell to our Eat Real to Heal podcast. Dr. Colin Campbell was born in 1934. He's a famous American biochemist. He specializes in nutrition on long-term health. He is the Jacob Gould Schurman Professor Emeritus of Nutritional Biochemistry at Cornell University. And that's just the beginning. If you want to get to know more about Dr. Campbell and the work that he's done, please read his book. He's a huge advocate of the low-fat, whole foods, plant-based diet. He's the author of over 300 research papers and 3 books entitled The China Study and another book called Whole and the Low Carb Fraud. Also, he's been interviewed by so many people, so you can watch hundreds of interviews, watch hundreds of YouTube videos online, and also watch Forks Over Knives, the famous documentary that really has converted so many people into being huge plant-based advocates. So please watch that documentary, in which he is also behind that documentary as well as being featured in it. Now, Dr. Colin Campbell is one of the lead scientists behind the China Cornell Oxford project on diet and disease that was done in 1983. Super important. You can read all about that in the China study itself. In addition to Dr. Colin Campbell having joined MIT as a research associate, he also worked for over 10 years in the Virginia Tech Department of Biochemistry and Nutrition. And he's an advisory board member on the Physicians Committee for Responsible Medicine. And he was also the senior science advisor to the American Institute for Cancer Research. Now, he also founded the Center for Nutrition Studies, which is an amazing online program that you can take. It's a 6-week program. Please, everybody sign up for it if you want to learn about food as medicine and how to stop and arrest and prevent and reverse chronic disease. Sign up for this program through e-Cornell. So it's through Cornell University. So without going on and on about, through Dr. Colin Campbell's long resume of incredible work that he's done on this planet to advance science and research around food as medicine. Let's jump into the Eat Real to Heal podcast. Redo that. Let's jump into this podcast and hear directly from Dr. Colin Campbell about everything that he's up to now and the legacy that he's leaving behind and the projects that he is creating now at 86 years of age, which is truly remarkable. It is never too late to create new programs to advance our societies, to make our existence on Earth better. And Dr. Colin Campbell is truly a hero. He's a healing hero. He's a wellness warrior. He's a renegade. And you need to learn as much as you can about this man and pass on that information to your family members and start making the lifestyle changes today to turn your health and your life around. So please share this episode with everybody that you know. Tell us what you think and enjoy. Hello, Dr. Campbell. It is such a pleasure to have you on our Eat Real to Heal show today.
Thank you. It's my pleasure, for sure.
And are you in your home in California? Is that where you are right now?
No, I'm in my home in upstate New York.
Oh, upstate New York. Why did I think you were in California?
I'm at Cornell University, or just outside of the town.
That's right. Okay, that's and do you spend a lot of time at the university, or is most of everything done online?
No, I still have a position at the university, but it's Emeritus, so I can come and go when I want to. Okay. But more importantly, I also have a nonprofit organization in my
Tell us
name,
about that.
nutritionstudies.org. That's in town, so I spend some time there, and the rest of the time on lectures, writing books. I'm just finishing up another book.
What's that book that you're working on?
Well, I have to tell what the China study was the first one. I was just basically attempting to explain what I had learned over the decades of my work. And then later I put the book out whole, which went into a little more sophisticated discussion of how nutrition works. This in turn is about how is all this applied? How do we get to know what we know? Why don't we know what we should know? And why has nutrition as a science been so misinterpreted?
So let's
Ages.
go from that. Why has nutrition been so misinterpreted? Because, for all the listeners out there, Dr. Colin Campbell has been writing about the subject, teaching about the subject, studying and researching food as medicine, nutrition as medicine for decades. But even still, and we have so many other physicians that are out there and PhDs and researchers, but it still feels like such a small percentage of the population has no idea about food as medicine. So why has it not been taken up so readily?
Well, I'm just finished now writing a book on that subject. Exactly that question. Why hasn't it been taken up? Why is it confusing? And just a little background, there's not a single medical school in the country or North America or elsewhere that actually teaches nutrition. Which raises the question, why not? And also, in the United States, at least, physicians don't have an opportunity to be reimbursed for services if they want to talk about this. It's kind of on their own time. So nutrition has been an outside science. And so what I got interested in many years ago when I spent a year at Oxford University in England was to go back into history and sort of see if I could learn something about, why did we end up with the nutrition message that we have now that seems to be so new, and why hasn't that been known before? And so the current book I'm now writing, just about done, is just about that story. And what I learned from that earlier history, and that's part of this book in this case, basically was that back in the 1800s, late 1700s, as a matter of fact, in the case concerning cancer, which was my specialty in many ways, I wanted to know, why wasn't anything said about nutrition and cancer? Learned, in fact, there was something said at the time. And it really came from the idea that cancer was some kind of disease for which there were two hypotheses. One hypothesis basically said that cancer is a local disease. Surgeons like that idea because they just simply said, well, we'll cut it out.
Yeah.
The alternative view was it was a more constitutional disease, meaning wholish disease, in which case the whole body is sort of participating. That's where nutrition happens to be, that's where it would be, because nutrition is everything working together, basically. It's not a single nutrient.
Exactly.
So things work together, and that's the fascination about this topic. So it would be a more holistic kind of approach. Or let's say in the 1800s, that would be called a constitutional approach, constitutional nature of disease. So they argued about that a great deal during the 1800s. Which is it, local or is it constitutional? They finally decided that cancer is a local disease, which means using surgery, cut it out, or a little bit later, use chemotherapy, where you could actually have targeted drug therapy. Or thirdly, use radiation, which you can narrow down and focus it, if you will. So there's three kinds of modalities or therapies that might be used that we still have today. And quite frankly, they're all poor in many cases. They don't do quite what they should do. But there were some major lessons there. Nutrition got left out. It got left out. And finally, that was in the middle 1800s, late 1800s, early 1900s, when all the cancer business started to get going. By that time, almost no one wanted to mention nutrition. Only occasionally would have mentioned something like this. And when they would mention it, it was pretty spectacular what they would say. But it got forgotten. And one of the reasons I think it got forgotten too was that nutrition was considered to be primarily an effect, a biological effect, largely dependent on the consumption of animal-based foods, more particularly in a nutritional sense, based on the effect of animal protein.
And did they know, how long ago did they know this?
Well, the protein was discovered in 1839, and it was said to be the stuff of life itself. I mean, it really went out with a grand opening of a grand baptism, and so it always became the center of the plate. They didn't think that time that plants also had protein. They generally always thought of protein being from animals, so it really was a sort of surrogate for consuming animal-based foods. And so some of these statements about nutrition having an effect, not necessarily saying how, some of these statements were made as early as the early 1800s. There was a medical doctor in the early 1800s, about 1805, who actually wanted to study the effect of vegetables on cancer. And he was turned down.
In 1805.
And he was turned down again to just do some research. And then throughout the 1800s, all the time, when somebody mentioned something about nutrition, it was always, oh, we don't know what that is. You know, which is it? This one or that or something else? And so it just by the time the 1900s rolled around, it was all about animal protein being the center of the nutrition discussion.
Yeah.
And there were some people at that time, really serious people, saying, you know, it's the animal protein that causes the problem. That got shot down immediately. If they talked about nutrition in general, there was no place at the table for that kind of idea. It was all about targeted drug therapy, or assuming that cancer is a local disease. This applies for other chronic diseases as well, as I should say. So all during that time, anytime that the word nutrition came up, it was always about talking about single nutrients. That it became particularly prominent during the 1920s and 1930s, when some of the vitamins were being discovered. But nobody could really put their finger on which nutrient it was that might be involved in cancer. Well, there is no such thing as a single nutrient being involved in cancer. If there's any, it's animal protein, not because of its own activity, but because of its effect on the total diet. In any case, so the story went on and on. Finally, in 1980, our National Academy of Science in the United States organized a study of 13 experts, so to speak, organized a committee to look into this question concerning the effect of diet on cancer. And I was one of the 13. That was in 1980. We spent 2 years, the 13 of us, talking about this question. What evidence do we have that nutrition might be involved in cancer? We came up with a conclusion, a suggestion, and we said basically to cut down fat intake, because that was sort of the popular idea at that time. Fat is related to cancer, and so forth and so on. And we said that. It basically began a really serious pushback from the industry. And that's a whole story unto itself. And the industry, by this, I'm talking about pharmaceutical industry and the livestock industry in particular.
Okay, so that's the part that I really want to just know a little bit more about, because, you know, I've been working with clients on the reversal of disease, chronic disease, all different types, cancers included, and where we teach the Gerson therapy. So it's, you know, at the end of the day, it's a plant-based, whole foods, low fat, low, low protein. I mean, it's high protein, vegetable protein, but low to no animal fat protein. And you know, the number one question people ask me is, why doesn't my doctor know about this? So then I explain why. You know, doctors aren't taught nutrition in med school. And then the second thing they say is, well, is it the pharmaceutical industry that's against this? But the part that I think people really need to know about, it's that connection between not just the pharmaceutical industry and the medical associations, but it's also the food industry. Right? And if they haven't watched these documentaries, a lot of people don't realize the amount of pressure that's put onto nutritarians or anybody who's talking about food as medicine. So can you talk about that a little bit? What does that look like, that pushback?
Yeah, well, that's very much part of my story. It's going to be part of the the story in my book.
Okay.
Because my story goes back even before 1980, but particularly during the National Academy of Science report at that time, and been the only one of two nutritional biochemists on that committee. The others were epidemiologists or cancer researchers or something like that. In any case, when the report came out, and we said some things about nutrition that kind of irritated the industry to some extent. And because I was the one who was then chosen to give testimony before the U.S. congressional committees, and I was on national TV and so forth and so on, I became the face of that report at the time to some extent, at least in my community. And that report, by the way, was the most sought after report in the history of the National Academy of Sciences. So it actually caused a lot of publicity, a lot of discussion about it. And then with my sort of being on, before congressional committees and on so forth, television, so forth, my society in the area of nutritional biochemistry really took it to me. I was fairly prominent in what I was doing in my society. I had just been named by the council, the executive council, to be the next president of the society. And so when they heard my voice talking like this, they figured I had betrayed the entire nutrition community. And so there was a petition put forward to have me investigated and to be expelled from the society. The first time this had happened in their 60-year history. So there was a hearing. I didn't get thrown out, but that's what happened. And then at the same time, instead of becoming president, that vote was null and void. I didn't become that, but that set a pattern thereafter for all sorts of attacks that occurred constantly from then until now. It happened both at the national level as well as at the local level in the case of my university. I was able to maintain and go forward with this in large measure because I had tenure. And so I'm a big, big fan of academic freedom, for example, which tenure is intended to protect. And so part of the book I'm talking about is actually telling that. Why did it happen? Who did what? How far did they go to try to block this? And so I've had many people trying to block what I talk about. On one hand, and some of it was very serious. I mean, really ridiculous things like sending around a letter to 32 of the prominent people in this country by the secretary of the American Cancer Society, sending around a letter that I had stolen $20,000 from my grant. And then a little later in 1988, I had the China study going at that time. We had received a lot of funding for that. And I organized a sort of an upgrade for that study. It really, I think it's still a great idea. I was awarded the funding. It was approved. It was approved with recommended for funding. I went to pick up the money then in Washington. I took my associate with me. And when I got there, I was presented with a letter that was signed Friends of the Institute of Aging, unsigned. And they alleged at that time that all the work I was doing in China was all a fraud. And the public hadn't learned about the China study at that time. That didn't come out until 1990. It's 1988. And so if I can't answer that, I've lost the money. I never got the money to do that study.
You never did?
I never did that. I did the regular China study. That was ongoing, and we got results out of it and so forth. It's fairly well known, as you know. But the addition to that study, which was the important part of it, where we were going to be working with 500,000 people, saving blood samples in storage, and then simply retrieving them to analyze for various things at the time they got a disease. It was a fantastic idea, I think. And we would have had a lot more information than we have today, but that was blocked. And it was $7 million. They took it away and said I couldn't have it. So I'm just mentioning these kinds of things because then at that time, in the early 1990s, it became particularly difficult. Because at that time, then there's words being spread elsewhere that somehow I'm a fraud, basically. And, I didn't know what I was talking about. And so it all came down to, if I can summarize this quickly, it came down to the fact that our work was showing that animal protein was especially prominent in the causation and possible treatment of cancer. That was like pouring gasoline on fire. To say that animal protein might have that effect was really deadly. And that was the reason for this. I should also tell you at Cornell, ever since I came back to Cornell in 1975, I was given a full professorship with tenure. So I had all the protection I wanted. And in fact, I had a university-based endowment professorship. So, and I had the biggest program, in our department, which was #1 in the country. I had the most publications. I brought in all those kinds of things. You don't pay much attention, but everything was going great. So my own reputation was I was very happy with it. But this all came into, even at that, the pressure that was being brought to bear to try to bring down my reputation, get me fired, kicked out of the university, certainly kicked out of my society, all of that came to the forefront. So at that time, I then was given took 1 year's leave to go to Oxford University as a so-called visiting scholar at Oxford. And it was there that I got into the literature, the history, because I wanted to know why this vitriol, at that time. What is it about it? What in the world am I doing to cause such hate? And so that was the impetus for my doing the history. And I think I found a great deal about what that was. Because in years past, occasionally somebody would come along and answer your question, would say something similar to what I'm saying. And they're kicked out of their society or they were maligned terribly. So that raised another question too. What is it about our system of medicine, if you will? What is it about our medical science field that would even dare to do something like this? And that's what this book is about. And I think I have the answer to that too. And it really has to do, as you might expect, with a lot of political and economic issues, very clearly. Yeah. But also it has to do in a major way with the way we understand the biochemistry of disease formation, the way we understand the biochemistry of nutrient effect. And so now I'm offering, actually, I've had a couple of papers out on this, but I'm offering a new way to think about nutrition and its relationship to health, especially on cancer, heart disease, and things like this. And my views on that also, in part, go back many years. But I'm suggesting that I'm redefining, actually, the whole subject of nutrition. It's going to be close to the Gerson, I should tell you, the Gerson thing. Charlotte Gerson was a friend of mine. Yeah. And we had a good relationship. And I don't should say it this way. I don't understand a couple of things about the Gerson therapy, but in general, it was a great idea. Mm-hmm. And it was brought to this country by Max Gerson, as you know, to North America back in the 40s. And he went through a lot of difficulty with that. He had to go outside the country to do his practice. So this whole story, for me, boils down to, more than anything, it's not just about why not use a plant-based diet, which is controversial enough, but it really boils down to the unusual understanding we've had about the basic science of nutrition. And in that sense, what I'm really referring to as much as anything else is the fact that we, in research, my area, medical research, and also medical practice, we tend to focus far too much on what individual nutrients might do. We focus too much on, let's say, treatment of a specific disease. We talk about treating symptoms, not getting at the root cause. And so all of that special focus came from, I'm suggesting, the local theory of disease. Mm-hmm. The local theory of disease was rejected in the late 1800s. I'm sorry, the constitutional nature of disease was rejected. Exactly. That's the Holistic view. The local theory of disease won out, primarily because that gave an opportunity to focus on individual things, whether they be pills or whether they be a narrowly focused beam of radiation, or whether it was surgery, whatever. So we've lived with that for all these years, right? So this becomes a big story in my view. It's this whole idea of thinking about health and diet, especially, and disease. There are two opposing views. One is to consider these relationships between food and disease in a holistic sense, everything working together.
Yeah.
The other is thinking about it in terms of individual diseases, individual mechanisms, so forth. And that's the system we're now living with. And that's why medical schools, who are what I call reductionists in training, highly reductionist. That's why they do not teach nutrition, because nutrition is the antithesis in philosophical, in that sense, from the local theory of disease. So there's two ways of thinking about how to deal with medicine. We chose the wrong path. It's not to say that the path we have doesn't work. In fact, there are occasions when it does work. Mm-hmm. You occasionally need maybe a drug on serious conditions, but not to rely on that as a lifestyle system of treating people with illness. And I'm basically now making the argument in my lectures and so forth that we've really got to first off understand nutrition. It's a science that's very different from what people have taught and very different from what people have heard. And when we understand that, then we can do amazing things in treating illness. Of course, heart disease has been demonstrated to be able to be reversed quite well. Mm-hmm. Diabetes you can do the same thing.
Very easy, yeah.
And in our research, one of the things that really got me going in this thing was our ability to turn experimental cancer on and off,
right,
by nutritional means. So
can you explain that to people a little bit more and talk about that research? Because so many people, like even this morning, I'm reading in the paper that they're out there doing the Ride to Conquer Cancer, and we're so proud that we raised like $100 million to go towards cancer research, and then followed shortly between like 1 in 2 people get diagnosed. Every 3 seconds there's hundreds of people that are being diagnosed with cancer, but no one, all these people who are raising this money for cancer research, they do not understand the mechanism of disease and the nature of disease. And so of course, all that money gets filtered into surgery, chemo, radiation research, which we are seeing these horrific numbers around cancer, which Max Gerson predicted 100 years ago. He said if we did not address nutrition as the basis of health, and if we didn't look at the constitution of the individual, then we would see cancer rates being 1 in 2. And sure enough, 100 years later, his predictions are correct. So if you can just explain that, because I often use that analogy, we can turn the genes on and off for cancer, as well as turn the genes that protect us from cancer, from these mutated cells, and being able to deactivate them or activate further mutations. So if you can explain that a little bit more, I think that would be so helpful for people.
Well, you're right. Cancer is generally considered to be a disease that cannot be reversed. The major reason, in my understanding of this, is that for a long time, especially since the discovery of genes and discovery of DNA, if you will, obviously that goes back a long ways, but especially since that kind of discussion started to become quite active in the 1950s, it's generally been said that cancer is a genetic disease. Everyone says that. If you go on their websites for cancer societies or the National Cancer Institute here in the United States, they'll tell you quickly, cancer is a genetic disease. Now, that being said, what does that mean? Well, it's true that normal cells are converted to cancer cells through a mutation. That's true. Because cancer has its own set of genes or genetically modified cells, if you will. And so that's where it starts. It starts in mutation. And now these days, we know there's lots more mutation might be added as cancer progresses. But in any case, It's a genetic disease. So they say. I disagree 100%. Because if we assume, and this is what I'm publishing a book, and I've had one paper on this, if we assume that cancer is a genetic disease, that means it cannot be reversed. So what does that mean? If it can't be reversed, we have to kill the cancer cells selectively, of course, if possible. That's what leads to targeted drug therapy. That's what leads to so-called cytotoxic chemotherapy. That word cytotoxic basically is meaning using drugs to kill cells. So the general approach, or we cut them out, if you will. And so that whole philosophy is fundamental to the entire cancer industry, worth hundreds of billions of dollars. If all of a sudden that basic assumption went away, they'd be in serious trouble. So that's what I'm writing about in the book. It's wrong, and it should be addressed forthrightly. Since cancer, if you just only assume it's genetics or genes, if you will, and it can't be reversed, then don't bother trying to figure out how to reverse it. Just get some pills or something like that to kill the cancer cells. Now we know that, for example, with cytotoxic chemotherapy, for example, that when a big study was conducted, published in 2009 by a group of Australian and US researchers, the big study was organized to go back and look at the data, the clinical data of cancer patients, to see what kind of effect cytotoxic chemotherapy really was having on cancer patients. Big study. They enrolled, or not enrolled, but they collected information on 22 different cancers. They had thousands. I don't know what the total number of examinations they had. They came out of the U.S. government website or collection of information mostly. But in any case, here's what they learned. They wanted to know if the cytotoxic chemotherapy is working. Well, the metric they use to measure how it's working is the effect that these drugs would have on, let's say, 5-year survival rates. That's a traditional thing they do in cancer research, I should tell you. You know, does it have effect on survival rates? It was shown for these 22 different cancers that these cytotoxic chemicals being used for each of these cancers in the aggregate increased 5-year survival rates only by 2.1%. Essentially, it was like had no effect.
And I read that study as well. I had come across that years ago. And from what I understand, they redid that study. Isn't that correct? Just recently?
Yeah, well, yeah, so what do you mean we did?
They redid the study just to see if their original data still held true. And
right.
So I just came across a new paper that also showed still the same thing. Since that study was published, there's been no improvement. They still have not been able to show that cytotoxic drugs has any effect on the cancer. I mean, it only in about 2%. And the part about that, which I find interesting, is that in many of those cancers, when you break them down, like if it's colon cancer, it has 0% effectiveness, is what that same study showed, if we're talking about the same one.
Yes, I'm sure we are, because it was increased 2.1%, but quite frankly, arguments were made in that paper, and I happen to agree with that. That, first off, is not statistically significant. Right. It's a null effect. There were a couple of cancers where you see some improvement of a few months maybe or something, but that doesn't really count in my mind.
No.
So 2.1%, there's some argument that it might have been higher had people done nothing. Or done something like the Gerson therapy, let's say, for example.
Right.
You know, where in fact, they could have lived longer. Because these cytotoxic chemicals that are being used are, as you probably know, they cause cancer themselves.
That's right.
And so, and they're very toxic, obviously, and they cause a lot of side effects, really serious side effects. So I think we put the nail in that coffin. They don't work. And so now we have some new ideas like immunotherapy, for example, which in principle is almost the same thing. What they're doing in that case, in one case at least, they're recruiting the ability of the immune system to produce cells that kill cancer cells, for example, the natural killer cells. And I'll come back to that later because we were working on that idea 30 years ago. But so the immunotherapy is still a case where there's interest in taking discovered a drug that can activate something in the immune system, so to speak, to let the body do it. But I think that's still wrong because we don't have control in that kind of case. There's necessarily going to do it in a very selective way. So there's still tons of money being poured into that. So I think the whole idea of treating cancer with drugs and ignoring diet, quite frankly, I think is ridiculous. And I'm going to say that, in my research, in this case, using experimental animals, the thing that really got me going was being able to turn cancer on and off dramatically. We could increase from zero growth to 100% and back and forth.
And what would you do to increase it to 100%? And then what would you do to decrease it and reverse it?
That's right. It was dramatic. The effect was very quickly how this happened. And we did it by using animal protein. Because I had gotten the impression in work in the Philippines, I was doing it in my early years, that somehow children were more likely to get a certain kind of cancer, liver cancer, when they were consuming the Western diet. And so I found that strange at the time because I was there and we were there to try to develop a program for feeding malnourished children, making sure they got more protein, not less. Mm-hmm. That was my background. So to see that result or get that impression that I got from learning from these children, that's what started my whole research career. And so when we came along and then tested the effect of protein on the models, we could turn it off. We could turn it, you give a diet, let's say it has 20% protein, which is on the high side. 20% of total calories is protein. We turn it on. If we drop it to 5%, that's enough for the animal. It certainly lives, but it turns off the cancer. So we switch back and forth between 20 and 25. Dramatic results. And I know that if I went now, of course, now it's too well, some people know about me too much, but if I went now to, let's say, a drug company or investors and show them the data, don't tell them how I did it. If I showed this effect, I am absolutely certain I could get hundreds of millions of dollars immediately available to invest in that, whatever it is I have. There's no question about that.
Right.
But the moment if I say it's animal protein, it sort of says they show me the door. So it gives basically that's what it is. It is what it is.
And is that because the food industry is so tightly knit with the pharmaceutical industry and so tightly knit with the medical industry?
That's a good question. I'm not sure. I'm not prepared to say that they are, in collusion. That's a famous word these days. Mm-hmm. But I'm not prepared to say they're working together to that end. But the fact of the matter is what they both do serves the same purpose. In other words, the food industry, largely based on the consumption of animal protein, by the way, as you know, meat, milk, and eggs, the food industry makes a lot of money on that. And so, in a sense, to be really caustic about the idea, they feed us or they have us eat the food that causes illness. When we get sick, then the drug industry has the drugs to make us well. So we're being played. The public is being played on two ends of that idea. One industry is keeping us sick. I'm not sure they sit down and actually talk it that way, but in effect, that's what happens. We eat the wrong food, so we get sick. The other industry said, well, don't worry about that. We got the drugs to make us well. It's a really, really ridiculous and dangerous experiment that's been conducted for decades.
And I would say too, to me, because when I came across this information, it was when a friend of mine was 72 years old at the time. This is 22 years ago. He did the Gerson therapy for his stage 4 cancer that had metastasized. He was given 3 months to live. And, he was my friend's dad. And, Bill was this guy who just he wasn't going to take, a 3-month life sentence. And so he did the Gerson therapy. He reversed his cancer. He lived another 22 years, which was amazing. But the thing is that when I started learning about this, I mean, I'm a researcher. I'm doing my PhD right now, where we're looking at reversing type 2 diabetes with the Gerson therapy and working with indigenous communities, because ultimately the Gerson therapy is a pre-settler or pre-contact lifestyle. Right? There's no refined garbage in there. There's none of these refined oils and sugars and refined salts. Like, if you had salt, you got it from the food. If you had sugar, it came naturally from the food. And they weren't extracting oils at that time. And so really, that's why I wanted to work with indigenous communities as well, because it's quite inexpensive, like eating squashes and potatoes and carrots and things like that. So if we can work with these indigenous communities and show them that they've had the answer the whole entire time to reversing diabetes, but it means going back to that. So, but I was in disbelief, if you can imagine, because I was doing environmental policy at the time for government. And I didn't know anything about nutritional science. I really knew about environmental toxicity and cancer. So when I found out that food was the answer to cancer that was caused by environmental toxicity, I was really in this place where I'm like, how could this be that we don't know this? And then I started to dive into the research and your research. I read the China study back then. And I couldn't believe that this research had been available to us for hundreds of years. We've known that nutrition is the answer to cancer and chronic disease. So to me, it's almost criminal. Like, the data has been there. And
That's
so
right.
how do we get people to the right people in the right places to look at this data? And I know that you've been trying to do that. And so to me, it's almost criminal. Like, it really feels like, I don't know. And you show it to the people who are, in these positions of power to change the medical system, to change the, the food system, and you show it and they just turn a blind eye to it. So how have you been able to persevere all these years in knowing that the research is there, plus you're contributing to this body of knowledge? Like, how do we go forward when the research is there, but people just don't want to look at it?
Well, that's the question for my new book. I'm trying to address that from different perspectives. And in the previous books that I did, and also some publications I've had recently, I tried to make the case based on just analysis of the science.
Right.
Basically on the basic fundamental mechanism by which cancer works and the fundamental ways we ought to be considering how nutrition works, if you will. So the science is one part of it. I think that's been very rewarding for me, but it needs more of the science. Unfortunately, the way it works now, incidentally, I should say before saying this, I spent about 20 years, very active years here in the States, very much involved in policy development, food and health policy. And so I was on a number of the so-called expert panels, mostly in Washington, but also elsewhere, where we were being requested to come up with various kinds of information having to do with food and health. That was quite an experience because that gave me an opportunity to see, if you will, the interface between scientific research on the one hand and political and economic interests on the other. That was very educational, I should say. And so I learned a lot, about how institutions become involved in this and how institutions take on the concept of what I call groupthink, that's a term used by others, and how, in fact, they end up managing. They actually manage whole societies with this philosophy. And such that, we end up creating, if enough years pass without that being questioned, then we end up with what I call paradigms, made famous by, before this time. But in any case, we end up with these massive society-wide paradigms where all of a sudden, most people, almost just about everyone, is thinking sort of the same way, not really investigating or questioning the fundamental characteristics of that paradigm. So some things that make a paradigm work, we don't see, we don't question, we just accept it. And so as long as those those structures, that structure is in place, and it is, it's very difficult then to go and try to make some kind of progress. And I'm trying to do that, in fact, with this book, because I'm redefining science, and I think it's really irrefutable. And I'm going back and getting research too that has been misinterpreted in the past, really major research, and just sort of aggregating that information or laying it out so that when we look at it in the aggregate, in the collective, it becomes so impressive. It's overwhelming. And so that is one story. The other story has to do with, as I said, is political and economic considerations. And again, I know best the United States system, but I know other Western countries too. I must tell you that in Canada, I've lectured in a number of places in Canada, including McGill University and there in Vancouver and so forth. The Canada is ahead of the U.S.
I think the opposite. I think we're so far behind in Canada. Tell me why. Because
well, come to this.
Like 2 plant-based doctors here, and the U.S. has dozens.
Okay. Maybe, but just remember, in Canada, recently, the dietary guidelines in Canada did come up and say something the U.S. has been afraid to say.
It's true, yes. The new plant-based food guide, or the new Canadian food guide, is heavily plant-based.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right.
We are ahead there.
And also, in talking to the various institutions in Canada too, they, from my perspective, they're a little more open-minded about looking at things more holistically. Of course, you're saying no, but you should be in the United States and have to see what I see sometimes. It's true that the plant-based idea is getting a bit of a foothold here, but you have Brenda Davis.
Yes, we do. Brenda Davis is my lifesaver up here. Otherwise, I'd be swimming alone in an ocean full of sharks.
And so you have her and a few others, not too many, I have to agree. David Jenkins, you probably know his name.
Yeah, we just reached out to him as well. Yeah.
David's been a long time acquaintance of mine, and in fact, in some ways a colleague. And I've lectured at the University of Toronto, but David was always sort of known. I don't think he minds my saying this, but he was generally considered to be, he was kind of in the establishment in a sense, but he was a vegetarian.
Right.
And he did not want that to be known. So some of us would say that he's a closet vegetarian.
Yeah.
But now he's changing, and now he's wanting to reach out, because he contacted me and he's talking to me a lot about some of the same questions you're asking. How can we make progress? With it, how can you get involved in it? I'm wishing him all the luck in the world, but it's tough. There's a guy, James Barnard, in Ontario.
I don't know about him.
Ontario? Do you know that name?
No, James Barnard. He's not related to Neil in any way, shape, or form, is he?
Pardon?
He's not related to Neil Barnard, is he? Dr. Neil Barnard?
No relation. And also no relation to another James Barnard at the Pritikin Center.
Okay.
So this James Barnard is a different kind of person. He spent 10 years early in his medical career working in the Eskimo regions in northern Canada.
Oh, wow.
And then he came down and he started working there I haven't talked to him in a while, in Windsor. I'm assuming
Ontario. Okay.
Yeah, contact him if you can.
I will.
If you want to talk to someone. So, coming back to the whole question, why isn't this not working? And why is this so difficult? These kinds of things we're talking about, whether we're talking about institutions or whether we're talking about individuals who manage the institutions or whose research depends on institutional support, whatever those institutions are. And I mean by that, in a larger context, that is to say, even government institutions, who in turn are reflecting corporate interests. So to my mind, and to a great extent, they're either working together or they're singing the same song. And they're working on this whole idea that reductionist science is the best way to do things. And I say, no, it is not. We have to come back to the concept of interpretation, which Dr. Gerson certainly practiced, was the therapy the clinics have been doing ever since. So coming back to this question concerning, how do we get this out there? I find that the leaders of these institutions, whatever degrees they have, it doesn't really necessarily mean anything to me. And of course, the public tends not to know because they're not being really told oftentimes, the real information. And I find a lot of that, I hope, can be explained away, by looking at the science more carefully, looking at it differently. I'm kind of hoping that I might have an opportunity to do that because the China study itself became quite well known, as you probably know, and now actually holds a record. It's the most translated, the book has been translated in most languages of any book in history, in the area of health and medicine. Dr. Spock, who was a so-called baby doctor years ago, this is on the internet. He had his second most translations next to the Bible. He had 42. We now have 47. And in
Dr.
fact,
Campbell, that is incredible. And you know what? It doesn't surprise me at all because I think it's one of the most relatable books for people to read as well. You don't have to have a science background. You can pick up that book. You can read it. You get access to such incredible data that even a person who's never heard about nutrition will read that and they can't help but there's that paradigm shift literally that I find happens when you're reading the China study. Which for a lot of people, when they have to piecemeal all the data together, they never reach that paradigm shift because their brain has to comprehend too many different pieces of information. And your book just explains everything so well, from the data to the history and to how the study was conducted. And, that's why I think it doesn't surprise me. So congratulations on that, by the way.
Well, thank you very much. I also wanted to ask you, did you see my second book called Whole?
Yes, we do. And I think we sell it at our restaurant. So we have a collection of 7 plant-based, whole food, 100% organic restaurants. So we sell a lot of books through there. And your book is one of them. And both of them, I believe. Right.
Well, Whole it was a New York Times bestseller. It didn't sell as much, but because the times were changing. But Whole is actually has been attractive for universities to some extent, medical schools, and begin to use it as a text or a major reference. And so this new, and the reason I guess I'm saying that is because I'm keeping my fingers crossed that maybe with that background and also with the film Forks Over Knives, which was actually started with that was a China study product. They came to me, 2 people, the director and the tall guy who did all the interviewing. They came and asked if I would do that, and I finally said yes. And so that's how that got started. That has now been seen by, I don't know, it's a minimum of 20 million people.
Oh, yeah. And that's my other go-to. Like I say to people when they're like, oh, I don't believe you, Nikki. I don't believe in the Gerson therapy. Who's this Max Gerson guy and all the research that he contributed to? So I just say, you know what? Read the China study, go to Whole, read Whole, and then also Forks Over Knives. And most people who come to me and say, hey, I've been diagnosed with an illness. Can you teach me how to reverse it with food? They often say it was because they watched Forks Over Knives and read the China study. That is what enabled them to even pick up the phone and book a session or an appointment with me.
There's one more film. I don't really know that. It's called Plant Pure Nation.
Yes. Yeah. Watch that as well.
Was the same producer as Forks Over Knives. It was my oldest son who was the director.
Oh, wow.
And, right now, that producer, John Corey, is now working again with my son, doing yet a 3rd film and working with us on some things. And we remain quite close. So we got some more very exciting projects about to happen.
Amazing.
So where did I go with all this? The point is that there's quite an audience out there now, I think. Yeah. So I'm kind of hoping that this new book will be seen for what I hope it will be seen. And that is talking about the whole idea that here we have this information in this day and time. We've been working with it now for a couple of decades. We have this information that's really quite extraordinary in a practical sense. Yet at the same time, as you posed the question at the beginning, at the same time, how can we have this information and not have it be better known? Why is it not better known? I mean, Dr. Gerson really, I've read some of his testimony that he had to give in the U.S. Senate at the time. Of course, I talked to Charlotte about that too. I mean, he really paid a price in a sense, and it was too bad. But
not unlike you, because like what Charlotte went through and what Dr. Max Gerson went through, and for anybody who's listening to this and don't know what we're talking about, Max Gerson he tried to give all of his case studies, his journals, his patients' diagnoses with their follow-up treatment showing that he had successfully reversed end-stage cancer. And he tried to give that to the American Medical Association, to the Pharmaceutical Association, said, you need to look at this research. He published, I think over 300 papers on, the potassium-sodium imbalance, on like all the different, he used the reductionist approach with his studies, because that was the only way that he could publish studies. So he wasn't able to obviously do clinical trials on the Gerson therapy together, but he broke down the therapy into its minute parts to show people why we need to have iodine in the diet, why we need to have nutrients from plants, and not just, individual nutrients in supplement form, but also from the whole food itself. He broke it down so that people would understand. But I mean, he was robbed. His studies were stolen. His case studies and patient files were stolen. People were fired who had any interaction and wanted to promote the Gerson therapy on his behalf, whether it was politically or economically or on media. And so Max Gerson, he was put through the ringer. He was told that medical students would not be able to graduate if they worked with him. There were so many things that he was up against, but we've just heard from you as well, Dr. Campbell, that, you had to face that as well, having millions of dollars in funding not given to you. And the same thing happened to Max Gerson, but the same things happened to us. We're not even, I'm still doing my PhD, so I'm not entrenched in the academic side from an employment standpoint. And already I've been told by professors that, you know what, I have no qualifications to talk about cancer and nutrition, so therefore I can't submit a proposal to do research on that. And I'm like, well, that doesn't make sense. We've had death threats. I was in China, and I was brought to China to teach 600 physicians last year on food as medicine and the Gerson therapy. They actually did a clinical trial. And so we went around traveling, teaching all these physicians. And one of the members of our team who organized the whole trip, she had a death threat. And on the last day, where they sent out an email that showed her being beaten up by whoever, and saying, if you don't stop what you're doing, this is what you're gonna look like. And that scared the daylights out of me, because I have 3 kids, and so I thought, okay, well, maybe I won't go back to China just yet. And we don't know who sent it. And our restaurants, we even received a letter from the FDA, not that we have the FDA in Canada, but saying that we're not allowed to promote our restaurant as being healthy food. And if we do, that they're going to come in and take, essentially do whatever it takes to make sure that we're not in operation. And it was all on formal letterhead. And obviously it wasn't the FDA, but it was somebody who does not want, nutritional medicine to succeed.
Right.
So it's, so I see what you've been up against, and I'm in complete awe that, you've persevered all of these years. But I think you've done it in a very smart way. Like you said, being involved in, policy boards, being involved in organizations where you can slowly, trickle in this information. But I mean, I was invited to a meeting with the Public Health Agency of Canada. And this is where I say that when you're like, Canada's ahead, I'm like, absolutely not. because the Public Health Agency of Canada had $29 million to give towards type 2 diabetes management. And when I said, what does management look like to you? They said, well, we need to get more people taking their insulin and diagnosed and taking their insulin, and we need to get people riding their bikes. And I said, why wouldn't we just reverse the disease? It's so easy to reverse. And the people in the meeting almost fell off their chairs when I said that we can reverse type 2 diabetes. And they said, that's not possible. And they said, well, and the third thing, their third mandate was to get people off sugar. And I said, sugar's not the cause of diabetes. It's this animal fat and protein. And they were like, well, no, that's not the science behind it. I'm like, what science are you reading? So this is why I'm like, we are, and this just happened last year. So, you know, this didn't happen 200 years ago or in, you know, the early 1900s. Right. This is like 2018, last year, that this is what these people in power. And of course, the person who's managing this $29 million budget, I mean, he's suffering from obesity. I can see he was sweating profusely, and that was definitely from heart condition that I could see. I didn't ask him if he had diabetes, but I wouldn't be surprised if he was pre-diabetic. Like, he had no understanding, and this is who we have in government managing millions of dollars and spreading messages that aren't true, right?
Wow. Yeah. Well, as we know, I mean, that's been a history of that, and it still continues to this day. I'm kind of hopeful, though, that we might have an opportunity to change that course, because
that's
now
what I want to know about.
Yeah, well, we have now access to the internet. We didn't have that before. What you're doing right here, for example, I mean, we're having this conversation. We've never met. You're doing your thing. You're working across the whole continent. And then I just, a couple of days ago, was with a woman in India who was running this organization to train CEOs better leadership skills. And she was asking the same question. She was not a nutritionist. She's wanted to understand, how could I essentially almost still be alive, and sort of talking about this way of getting those kinds of things going. So here we have internet. We can tell all kinds of stories. Right. And I think that's going to basically, this is people power, because now we do have some mechanisms to do that. And so the more we can spread the word, and the other side of the coin is too, just to follow up on this, one of the questions I found it difficult to know how to answer it, but I think I'm getting a feel for it. Namely, let's imagine that everybody listens to what we're saying. And let's imagine that they all did that. I think it's fair to say that 80% of the total healthcare costs would disappear.
100%.
I think that's a conservative estimate, to be honest about it. And some people in medicine think I'm crazy, but that can be documented quite easily. What if that? Well, that means that an awful lot of people are going to be out of work. And job security is a very important thing to everyone. And so if all of a sudden you lose that number of people, they're suddenly going to, it'll be gradual, of course, but we have to find ways for re-engaging them in other, meaningful work where they can get wages and pay. And so that's a hard question to answer. But in my view, the best way to answer that, rather than tackling it up front too much, it basically starts off with information. Let the public know. Let the public really get to know how important this is. And then once that begins to occur, the public, I have great faith in the human society. When these kind of crises, if you will, sort of emerge, and it may happen pretty fast once it starts going, then it behooves the society to, I mean, they figure out ways to have a new work. And there is new work. I mean, food production, for example, can change course. Exactly. Everybody can spend more time, and small farmers can have more opportunities to produce the food that we all would like to have. And then there's a lot of healthcare kinds of work that people could be employed, and government can stand in too to help out in that effort. And that's one of the things they should do. The chances of that happening in Canada still, I would say, might be better, because you have a slightly more socialist system than we do here. We have an intense capitalist system. And I'm free market on the one hand, but on the other hand, the free market ideas have gotten out of hand.
Agree.
And it's so we have to talk about that subject.
Yeah.
But I think there's ways. Most importantly, let the information come out because everybody deserves it, and let people start thinking collectively. How they can, if they lose their job, well, we have to work in some ways to make sure that they're taken care of until they get retrained or something like that.
Yeah, well, I have the idea that every doctor out there should become a farmer, at least part-time, because when they're a farmer, they can also become a researcher. So they're contributing to healthy food production. And I'm not talking about animal farming. I'm talking about, raising, squash and tomatoes and carrots and onions,
right.
That type of farmer. And then they can see the research happening right in front of them, because they'll see it in the earthworms and how they migrate through the soil. They'll see it in the microbiome and the fact that you can't farm nowadays because we've decimated our soils with so many, toxins, especially glyphosate. So how do you rebuild that? So they're going to learn the science of rebuilding soil, which is the same science as rebuilding our constitution, right? Our human body and our microbiome and our guts and our cells, right? It's the same.
By the way, while you're saying that, I happen to have met during the last couple of years a doctor, medical trained doctor, who bought a farm outside of New York City, and he's joining, agriculture with medicine in a sense. And in fact, I spent some time with him, and somebody you might want to interview too.
Who's that?
I'm going to look up here on my, give you some information on him. His last name is Weiner, W-E-I-N. Let's see. No, Weiss. I'm sorry, Weiss. It's Ron Weiss, W-E-I-S-S.
Okay. I'm going to get in touch with him for sure.
And he lives in New Jersey.
I will definitely, I'll reach out to him. The other doctor that we had on our podcast recently is Dr. Zach Bush, and he's out of Maryland, and he's doing the same thing. He's all about soil regeneration. He has a plant-based whole foods clinic where he's actually hung up his white coat because he's a medical doctor, and now he teaches plant-based whole food nutrition for the reversal of disease. But he's partnered now with all the farming organizations, and he travels around the world teaching farmers how to regenerate soil so that they can grow clean, real, plant-based food. And then through that, we can collectively reverse this epidemic, chronic disease epidemic. So he's another amazing doctor. So I'm going to connect Dr. Zach Bush and Dr. Is it Weiss or Weiss?
Weiss.
Weiss as well. Yeah.
By the way, I will tell you another person too. It's our daughter, actually.
Oh, really?
Yeah, she graduated Cornell, a couple degrees, and one in nutrition, one in more of the social kind of things. Then she got a PhD in education. It's the kind of education that has to do with, she calls it global roots, transcendent borders. In other words, she went to the Peace Corps after she finished, had a fantastic time for a couple of years in the Dominican Republic in the mountains.
Yeah.
And she came and raised some money and built 2 schools back in the mountains where there were no schools. And then she met a fellow, she married and had 2 children. And those 2 boys now themselves have just graduated from university. And one of them, University of North Carolina, one of them just got the award for the best writer in the university. And he's the one working with me on the new book, I will say. But anyhow, what she did, she went back to the Dominican Republic. She's been bringing down students from the United States, both university-based students, like exchange like that, as well as high school students. And what she's working on is she's built a place in the mountains, and she's working on sustainable agriculture. She's producing food and wanting to show how, you can, it's sustainability sort of thing. That's her other son, and the other son is right now just finishing up making a new course, a new certificate program for our online course on sustainable food production. So to join the food environment issue. So one of them is, to say, works in the book, is a writer. The other, she now has this place in the Dominican Republic where she's bringing down students for conferences. It's very exciting. They come to small groups, and then they spend a week, and they sometimes listen to lectures.
What's your daughter's name? How do I find her? Well, you can
Oh, her name is, she goes by Campbell. She does her.
Okay.
But it's Leanne, Leanne. The A is capitalized. The L and the A are capitalized. Okay. Leanne. And she lives in Salcedo, near Salcedo, the Dominican Republic. But she's got an email. It's been, we've been down there. She has this, she built this place. And she's not now married. That marriage didn't last, but her two sons are going to be working a lot with her. And she's, this is a building for which she has a nice living space in one end of it, and a beautiful office up in the third floor looking down across the valley. The rest of it is a forum or an auditorium that seats 100 people.
Wow.
And so she brings people there, and she shows, she lives pretty much on her own food that she raises. And now she just bought some new land. She's building these, what do they call them? Aircretes, a word you may not have heard. An aircrete is a building that's designed, it's all concrete, but with windows in it. And it's rounded like this.
Yeah.
And so it's earthquake proof. It's also hurricane proof with the hurricanes there. And so she's got about 8 of these, and that's the community that she's building. And they're being built very fast. Then she can bring down people to get involved in these conversations and to see what it's like, to see the effect of food on the environment and how the environment is being destroyed right there in that area by the substitution of cattle for trees, and how the water dries up and how you can restore it. It's so exciting.
That is amazing. I want to have her on the podcast as well, because she's doing incredible work. And the reason why I'm smiling so hugely is because I have 3 girls, and I wonder, do I talk about this too much at home? I have clients that show up at my house asking on me how to do the Gerson therapy. So we invite them in for dinner and they sit down. I mean, my kids are surrounded by these conversations all the time. So I wonder if they're going to go out and become dairy farmers, or if they will go into,
How old are they?
My youngest is 7, 8 years old now. She just turned 8 last week. And then I have a 12-year-old and I have a 14-year-old.
Oh, wow. They would, she brings down high school students. The youngest one, 14, I mean, would almost be in a position if we're of interest. She would do it, actually. She just did her yoga teacher training last year, and she's worked at our restaurant. She helps out there every summer, and she loves working in there. She's one of our best employees, and you can go in and ask her anything about nutrition, and she'll just start spieling off science. It's beautiful. And, sometimes customers come in and they're like, but I need to eat my meat, and she'll always have a response for them around, how much protein we need. So I think she'd be ready to go for sure. Wow, what a team you have, a team of family members that are doing things to change the world. And all of this does give me hope. And like you said earlier, we need that hope to be able to keep going and keep doing this stuff. And, and we know that there's going to be a tipping point. And I believe that all of this work that, Dr. Gerson's been doing, you've been doing, your daughter and your grandchildren are doing, and all the other amazing researchers and scientists and doctors that are in the plant-based movement. It's bound to reach a tipping point, but sometimes it still seems like we're so far. But it also has just been in the lifespan of human history. It's just still been a blip in human history where we've gone really severely off course. So, yeah. So one of the things I really wanted to
touch on with you, because I was the MC at Charlotte Gerson's memorial. The family, it was really an honor to be asked by their family to honor Charlotte in that way. And so we got to read your beautiful, beautiful tribute to Charlotte. But all of us were so surprised by your wife's story. It was something that none of us knew about. Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because I know she was diagnosed. And was she diagnosed with cancer?
Yes.
And tell us about the story of her being diagnosed, and then how you made the decision around her treatment. Because I'm sure a lot of people would love to know, what you were faced with this. So you had to, make decisions that were
Right.
decisions.
Well, we gradually got into this over the years, starting in about 1980, a long time ago. It took us about 10 years to make some substantial changes. And finally, we pretty much got there, we thought, in the early 90s. But in any case, like some people, you drift a little bit. And so in 2005, when our China study came out, that was in January 2005. In December that year, in the fall of that year, she had a sort of a mole on her leg that she was just a routine checkup or something. They checked it out, and they found that it was melanoma. It had gone into her lymph glands, and it was pretty serious. So it was declared, advanced melanoma. And we were surprised because we had been sort of doing things more or less right, but not completely. And so that changed things quickly. But in any case, she went to the doctor. They took off that little leg problem, but that wasn't really part of it. But then they wanted to do chemotherapy, and they had her scheduled for chemotherapy, and they had her scheduled also for surgery to remove that whole lymph gland basin in her leg. And that's pretty serious. The combination of chemotherapy and that. And so I was with her. The doctor didn't know who I was. I didn't want to say that because it was her decision. And so the doctor said to her, well, this is on a Friday. He said, I think it was Tuesday. He said, we have an opening. We could do something. And she looked at him. She said, I'm not doing it. And he said, what? That's basically was kind of reacted. She said, I'm not doing it. And she said, I'm doing nothing. And he kind of freaked out. He said, it was quite informative to me, because he said, if you come back here in 6 months, there's no way I cannot take care of you. And so, it kind of frightened her. I mean, you tell that to people. I'm starting to wonder myself.
Well, of course, yeah.
What is she going to do? But I had the good fortune of having met the pathologist who was looking at her cells. And I could see that in the so-called lymph gland, there's a part of the lymph gland called the sentinel area. Mm-hmm. And in the sentinel area is where they took the sample, the bioassay. And sure, the melanocytes, the black cells were there, but they were distributed in the cell rather uniquely. And my son, our oldest son, discovered this guy in England who was working with this concept of using that as an indication of cancer. In any case, he had worked with 38 patients and found out that people whose melanocytes were in the region where hers were, that when they went on, it was able to be reversed. So she was happy to hear that. I was too, of course. And so she did nothing, but only just to live with what he said, and how he was actually, really rude and really unpleasant. And I'm thinking to myself, how many cancer patients go to the doctor and the doctor becomes really heavy-handed?
Oh, all the time. Every one of my clients has a story exactly like that. Either that, or the oncologist is very sugary sweet, and they're like, but I care so much about you and I want you. So, if you don't go and do this, just think about your kids. And so then my client comes back to me and be like, oh, my oncologist, they're so kind to me. Like, they've become my friend. So people say that. And I'm like, at the end of the day, no oncologist wants to see you die. But at the end of the day, they want you to do treatment because that's all they know. That's the only
Right.
thing they can offer you. So they will get you to do it, whether it's a heavy-handed, like I'm going to be so rude and mean to you and scare the living daylights out of you, or they're going to be so sugary sweet around it. So I've
You're
seen
absolutely
both.
right.
Yeah.
There's a word for the sugary sweet kind. What's it called? Something, I forget the word, but I know exactly the kind of people you're talking about. Well, ever since then, she's had no problem. Of course, when I went to the pathologist, by the way, and I saw the distribution of the melanocytes in the cells and so forth, I got the impression that she may have had that disease a little before, and it was actually it was already in regression when they looked at it. It may have been a regression.
Oh,
That,
from
so,
switching the diet earlier.
because I saw with our animals, experimental animals, I saw the same thing. We were actually working with a lesion. It was called, they were called GGT foci, whatever. And they're the ones that would come and go. And they're early on, they're leading to cancer for sure. They have a 99% correlation with cancer. So they are early cancer. But we could turn them on and off, very easily. And so I started thinking that I think that condition that she had, that microscopic pathology report was such that it indicated she was probably on her way back because she had been already doing the diet for a while.
Right.
And so whether that was the case or not, can't say for certain, but one thing is clear. She's had no problem, for the next, 14 years.
Right. And the same thing happened to Howard Strauss, who's Dr. Max Gerson's grandson, and the son of Charlotte Gerson. And he met his wife, and she had already had melanoma twice, and she had already been treated twice with chemotherapy. And I want to bring her on the show to talk about her experience as well. But Howard had just asked her to marry him, and she said yes. And then all of a sudden, they found out that for the third time, the cancer had come back. And so they said, okay, chemo again. And she was about to go down that route. But Howard's like, I'm the grandson of Dr. Max Gerson. Like, are you really going to go down that path? And has it even worked for you? And so she did the Gerson therapy, and that was 30 years ago. And
Wow.
has it come back?
Wow.
Yeah.
The Gerson thing, incidentally, I got really caught up in that too, because in 1994, when on the campus teaching, I did a lot of teaching. I organized a new course. It was called Vegetarian Nutrition. I wasn't too excited about that name, but anyhow, we did that. And I had one paper I wanted the students to see first. It was a paper by Hildebrand.
Right, Gar Hildebrand.
Reporting on what the Gerson Clinic had done. There was one case where the data had been reported. Mm-hmm. It was quite amazing. A 6-fold decrease in stage 4 cancer. It was really quite amazing. And so I just had the students do that. And my course, in fact, in some ways, started off with that sort of flagship study. And then I said, okay, let's go from here and let's see what else can we learn about all this. So,
yeah, that was the question. And I think that's incredible, because sometimes just planting the seed to open up people's minds, which will get them to, say, okay, well, there's one study, like maybe I should look into this further and see if there's other people that have published things that are similar. And there was a study done by Dr. Lechner out of Austria. And I know when I met you, I think it was at the plant-based, the PCRM conference last year. Was it there? No, or was it
PCRM? No.
No, then Plantrition, not the Plantrition. It's the other conference in California, the Holistic Nutrition Conference.
Oh, maybe the American College of Lifestyle Medicine.
Yes, I believe it was that. So I remember you just come off stage. There was like 200 physicians lined up to talk to you all about food as medicine. You delivered that incredible talk about how, this research has been there for 200 years. Like, we need to pay attention. But the one thing that I got out of that conference and the PCRM conference is all of these scientists and physicians are presenting this research on nutrition, but nobody's teaching the physicians in the audience how to do it. They're presenting the science, but no one's saying, what is the actual like, how many carrots do you eat a day? Or, how do you incorporate this? And everybody has a little bit of a different twist, like lots of nuts and seeds to no nuts and seeds. And, so I know that a lot of the physicians that I talked to at the conference, they were shocked. They were like, oh my gosh, this research is there, but what do I do? And one physician is like, how do I ever prescribe medicine again? And, but then they didn't know how to move forward with this new information about nutrition. So after all of these, I watched literally about 200 people come and talk to you in this incredibly long lineup. And I got to bump into you at the lunch table, I believe, outside or on the patio. And, the question that I had is, it's amazing how a lot of these researchers there were presenting their studies as though they were brand new. Like, we've just come across this information that food is medicine. And, but then it was just left at that. And when I did ask you about the Gerson therapy, and, you said, and you told me that you were a lifetime friend of Charlotte Gerson, you had all this respect for the Gerson therapy. And that gave me confidence, because I feel like I've been doing this alone. So that was some validation for me. So I thank you for that. But I loved your comment, because you said, but the one thing I've never understood is this whole coffee enema business. And you just said you hadn't, really looked into it. But there was a study done by Dr. Lechner out of Austria, where they actually administered the coffee enema before surgery. So these patients who were going through surgery and after surgery. And what they saw is that they needed less pain medication. And they healed faster, and they needed less medications overall post-surgery, and the healing took place much faster. So that was very, yeah, no, it was very interesting. And I mean, and it is a hard thing for people to wrap their head around, because most people, I think, are, they're bootstrapping it when it comes to all of this information, trying to piecemeal everything together and trying to figure out, well, how do you do this to reverse disease? And the Gerson therapy does give you the step-by-step, guidelines, including like, you take this much of this and, this much of that, and this is the ingredients you use in the soup and everything like that. But my whole point around it is that I think sometimes just introducing someone to one paper, which is exactly how Max Gerson got into this. One person put one paper across his desk and said, hey, did you know that there was a relationship between diet and disease? And that's what started it off for him as well. So I have to say that, just thank you for doing that when you were teaching, because I bet you it changed a lot of your students' lives just to be able to be presented with that information. Just one paper.
Working in the medical community has actually been one of the more positive experiences, because a lot of communities, especially professional communities, they don't light up like that. But I think the doctors are actually they didn't in the beginning, but now when I speak to physician groups, there's a lot more interest and understanding, and I think it's growing rapidly.
Oh, I think so too.
So that's real positive, because to have the physicians on board. I mean, obviously, that's the first group that's in contact with the public, and they've got to be on board, or else we would have problems forever. But
so what advice do you have for physicians? Because I work with a lot of physicians, and I mean, a lot of these physicians are suffering from their own mental health issues, their own diseases, and then they discover food as medicine, and that puts them into this mental whirlwind, because they're in the medical institution that they can't really extract themselves from, but they don't know how to practice within it. So what advice do you have for the physicians out there when they discover nutritional medicine? And how do they move forward? Do you ever give advice on that? Or what are your thoughts?
I do talk to people a lot. Of course, I'm not a physician, so I rely on what others are saying. I actually, our son who co-authored the China study with me, he's a physician, and he now has a really nice position at a major medical school. In fact, he's the medical director of a significant program in actually weight management, but he took the position because they were letting him organize a research program in that, on the whole food plant-based diet. So now he has funding to already start the first study, which is doing a study on the effect of the whole food plant-based diet on women with metastatic breast cancer. That was the first round at stage 4. and this, it's returned. And a second study on chronic kidney disease.
Mm.
And so he, at the university, his wife also is a physician. They organized this program, and they are concerned. They've concerned themselves with how to, talk to doctors about this. There are people at the university, at the medical school, who have they recruited him. I mean, it's quite nice because that wouldn't have happened before, because they knew his background. And now he's got a couple other people in other departments, in oncology, for example, who are, they're listening, and he gives quite a lot of lectures himself. And he's a very good lecturer also. So if you want to talk to a physician who has, done that, he would be a good one.
Yeah,
Another
I'd
one,
love to talk to him for sure.
I think another guy is in two more people, a woman and, gosh, it's Sanjay, I forget, I think I can get her name, but she had an experience with MS.
Oh, Dr. Saray
Yes,
Stancic.
that's it.
Yes.
Yes, Saray Stancic. She's really good. And then there's Rob Ostfeld, Ostfeld.
Okay.
He's at Montefiore Hospital in New York.
Okay, I will find their information.
Both of those, Stancic, I think she's outstanding, and Ostfeld is very committed. What he does, he gets patients in the hospital. He has an active practice. All of his patients who end up in bed, first thing he makes them do is wash forks over knives, and it really has quite an effect on him. So he's a really nice guy, and he speaks fairly often at different conferences.
And you know what's interesting about that, going back to this whole, where I feel Canada's behind. So for 4 years, we've been working with the provincial government to get our food from our restaurants into the hospitals. And on April 1st, we finally managed to get our food into hospitals, which is, you would think that's amazing. And, we have a contract with them right now, and so I don't want to blow it, but I have to just, put this interesting conversation that we had out there, because they said, okay, well, with your messaging and when you're doing marketing, you can't really market to anybody internally because of the fact that if we give you the right to market, you as yourself as a vendor, we have a product, we'd have to give Coca-Cola the right to market as well. And so, which is understandable, but then the whole reason they wanted us in there is because they want to provide healthy food that's in accordance with the Canadian Food Guide. And, but then now we can't market. But then the other thing that they said, which was really interesting, was they said, well, also, like, don't say that your food can reverse disease, because if there's the gentleman who has kidney dialysis who's in the hospital and he sees that, it might make him feel bad that he didn't know this information before. So here we are now, we're in this amazing position with our food in the hospital, which they've, we're in a dark, danky cafeteria, that most of the people who even know anything about food and medicine, they're like, not going to go down there, but now we can't let them know that we're even there. So it's really, when you make 2 steps forward, and I just have to accept that it's sometimes 1 step back, and it means we need to get creative. But it's like, if we can't even put our message out there that you can get healthy food downstairs, then it makes it really challenging. And if it's all about not offending somebody who's already sick in the hospital, whereas I love what, was it your son that's doing this, or Dr. Ostfeld that is making them watch forks over knives when they are a patient in the bed?
That's Ostfeld.
Yeah, like that is an amazing thing. And this is what we need to be doing on a global scale, right, is sharing the research and in the easy to digest formats, like these documentaries in your book, and just give it to them while they're in the hospital. And then they might make different decisions like your wife did.
Right. By the way, on food, it sounds like I'm promoting what my family's doing, but I will tell you, my oldest son is the one who did the film, Plant Pure Nation, and he's the one who has all the, or his nonprofit has wellness groups. He also has a line of food that now has been picked up by 1,500 stores in the United States. It's plant-based, low-fat. A couple of them have a little more, some of the nut sauce than the others, but basically that's all they have. Those foods have been tested, in immersion trials. And the big grocery company called Publix.
Okay, we don't have that in Canada, but I know it from the States. Yeah.
And then there's another one, I forget the name of it, and now he's apparently talking to another two or three. That looks like it's really going to be taken off because that food, and so far it's really done well. They moved it, when it first introduced to the stores, you started out at the lower level. Yeah. It's been elevated now to eye level. So it's that's, I think, quite tasty, and it's very effective.
What's the name of this company? We totally want to promote it. This is amazing.
It's all called, the website is Plant Pure Nation.
Oh, okay. So that's the name of his company that makes the food.
That's the name of the company, as well as the name of the film that he did.
Yeah, we'll definitely include all this information about your daughters, the work that she's doing, the Plant Pure Nation, the work that your son is doing. I agree with what you said. It definitely is about getting the information out there and sharing the stories because, we are still an oral society for the most part where we learn by sharing these stories with other people. So it is really important that we do that. Wow, you have a very incredible family, Dr. Campbell.
Well, they do it thanks to my wife. She's the one very good.
Okay, you're not going to take any credit for that.
No. There's did I hear you say you took our course or didn't? I can't remember. Somebody told me that recently.
So a lot of our students that go through, because we have a program that teaches our students how to teach the Gerson therapy feathers and how to connect them with a Gerson practitioner. And so it's our nutrition and detox training. But a lot of our students, they go on to do their master's in public health, and they go on to start, food companies all around the principles. And then we had several students who've gone on to take your course as well. So I haven't taken it, but I want to take it. And so I brought it up yesterday thinking like, oh, am I going to sign up for it now? But I am doing my PhD right now, so it would be a lot on my plate.
Well, send me your, I have your thing here. I'll send it down for maybe some dispensation to sort of get you into the program if you want to do it.
I would love to do it. And it's definitely been on my list to do it for a long time. And it was just a matter of, with all our businesses and my school to find a time to do it, but I would love to do it. Yeah.
We have a new that's a certificate program, as you may know, but we have a new certificate program also coming out on the food and environment. My grandson, actually the one that's been heading that up and developing all the material for that course. It's now all, the content is already prepared. They're just now interviewing some people, some experts in different disciplines to come and participate in our course.
Wow.
That'll be available sometime in a few months down the road.
Okay, that's amazing because we have one university. Oh yeah, go ahead.
The environment food connection is a really important one, as you know.
Oh, food and environment. And this is how I wrote my first paper on soil and selenium and disease 22 years ago when I was in one course. They offered one course in my university called Agriculture and the Environment. But they weren't teaching about disease at all. It was more about the politics of subsidies and, and how that related to, and the effects of, animal-based farming. So they were teaching that 22 years ago, which was amazing. But I found this one study and, I talk about how it was on the old Mac computer with the green cursor, it wasn't easy to do research and, nobody was shipping books back and forth back then. So it was hard to do research, but I wrote my first paper on selenium and soil and cancer. That was my first introduction to the fact that our body needs nutrients and needs micronutrients, not the macronutrients, but the micronutrients in order to be able to prevent disease. And my professor at the time, this is the professor who wrote a big F on my paper in red, like right across the whole thing, and said, "You're not qualified to talk about this subject matter."
Wow, that's ridiculous. So ridiculous.
It's so ridiculous. Of course, who knows? Maybe he had somebody who was going through cancer and this concept about nutrition and cancer, who knows? But I still persevered, and I ended up learning about, the Gerson therapy and studying that extensively. And then I went and did my pre-med sciences to actually go to med school, because I thought this is where I could have the biggest impact. And I wrote my MCAT. But it was amazing, because having studied nutrition before going in and doing my pre-med sciences, it was an eye-opener, because actually it's right there in the basic first year and second year biology, biochemistry, biophysics. The answers are in there. It actually says our body needs nutrients at high levels, and that we can turn cancer on and off like a light switch. In my pre-med studies, it was said there. But I remember a doctor who tried to talk me out of going to med school, and probably succeeded. He said, don't worry about remembering the biology and biochemistry of the body. He said, you know what, you're going to have to reserve all your brain power for remembering the diagnosis and the treatment and the pharmaceutical drugs. He says, that's all you're going to have space for in your brain. And I seriously, and I almost wanted to cry.
You must have known the Keishan disease story in China.
It's ringing a bell. Did you write about it in the China study?
I don't think I did, but there was a study done in China back in 1970s. I went to China the first time in 1981, and as a result of a Chinese, the senior author of that study had come to the United States. He was the first Chinese to come, first scientist to come to the United States to study, and he came to my laboratory, and that's how the whole thing got started. But he and his group in China had done this study on selenium and heart disease, childhood heart disease, endemic cardiomyopathy, I think they called it. And so what it turned out to be the case, there's a band geographically, there's a band from Northeast China, the Heilongjiang community, down to the far southwest. It's kind of just a narrow band all the way across the country, where selenium is very deficient. And what they had discovered many, many years ago was that there were children there who were getting this endemic cardiomyopathy with a lack of selenium. So then they went and started supplementing these children with selenium. And that was all in Chinese. That was they hadn't been published in anything in the West at the time. And that study, the guy who was the head of that is one that came to my laboratory and worked for a year. And he was the senior author of that study. It was eventually published in the West.
Wow.
But it was about selenium, which you were just saying, selenium and in this case, heart disease. Yeah. And it was soil. It was basically a soil problem, because it was this geographic band across China where it just turned out that selenium was deficient, and the children all occurred in that band.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I came across I probably did come across that study because it sounds so familiar. And there was a similar study done, and I think it was in Taiwan as well, and it had to do with iodine. And they found that there were high miscarriage rates in this one farming region, where when they looked at it, they saw that the soil was deficient in iodine. So what they did is they divided up the farmland, and they replenished the soil, or the iodine in the soil, in one half of the farmland that one half of the community could only eat from, and the other half of the community, they left it alone. And sure enough, right away, the miscarriage rates dropped significantly as well. And so again, it comes back to, and they almost dropped to nil. And Max Gerson wrote extensively about how we need iodine to be able to treat chronic disease and cancer, and how, our soils are so deficient with it. So, and this is the thing though, is that, there's that study from China around selenium, and this other study from Taiwan around iodine, and everybody's looking for that one hit wonder. Like, is it just the iodine? If I just replenish my diet with selenium, and people really need to move away from thinking it's just one nutrient, but it's all those nutrients. So, and how do you, I'm imagining you have so many people that come to you, and how do you respond to them when they come up to you and they say, so what should I do? What's your one answer to that when you have a couple minutes with people, because you have a lineup of 200 people behind who are probably going to ask the same question?
That's so common. And I really feel like I can't answer that question because, there will be occasions, of course, when a single nutrient, a supplement, for example, under some circumstances, might have some effect. And I allow for that personally. I mean, and that's the kind of thing that would happen in cases where there is a clear deficiency, number one, or maybe some other extenuating circumstances. So that kind of thing can happen, but maybe in the short run, from time to time, okay, but that's not a lifestyle strategy, because just as you said, that's not it. It makes a little money for people who want to sell that supplement, but it doesn't work that way, not in the long run.
Yeah. So what is a lifestyle strategy then that you would share with people to sum it up really easy for our listeners who are on this podcast?
I got two things. I have to confess that the biology of nutrition and the biology of disease formation or treatment, if you will, that biology is infinitely complex. And I really want to emphasize the word infinite, because the numbers hardly mean anything to any of us. We can't wrap our brains around it. So, and then within all that infinite complexity, there's this amazing demonstration of symphony. Somehow things are kept in order, and it works. But it works best when you have the right food. So the first thing I say, okay, let's agree that the biology is so complex, and let's say that nature will take care of that for us, for the most part. There's two remaining ideas that makes, to simplify things you just said. Number one, eat whole food. And just try to eat whole food as much as you can. That means not using the oil or sugar extracted from it, but just use whole food. And the second is, don't eat any food that has animal protein in it. You see, I came from the other side of the fence. I was all about promoting the consumption of more animal protein. So I find it hard to say, the best way is to avoid animal protein. Those just simple ideas. Eat whole food, don't eat animal protein. I can't believe it can be any simpler than that.
I love it.
I see it just as a goal. I don't like to see it as a black and white prescription. Is say, okay, here's the goal. And when the closer the person gets to that, the better they're going to be. So if you want to really get it right, go the whole way. Let your body adapt, and you'll find, you can adapt to this. You lose your food allergies and your taste preferences, they change. And when you get there, you're home free. Then it becomes a way of life. So there's two ideas: whole food and no animal protein.
That's amazing. Yeah. And I think for the people listening, I mean, Charlotte Gerson used to say it. At the beginning of her lectures, she would say, okay, what I'm about to tell you is going to seem like it's so simple that you're not going to believe me. And she said, but it is so simple. And she would pretty much, the whole lecture would be about those two things, like eat whole food. So like not whole wheat flour, but actually the whole food, like as it was picked from the earth and from the tree and plucked out of the ground. And, before it gets manufactured and dismantled and, it gets pulled apart, it's eat the whole thing and eat the skins. Like, you can eat this. Right. A lot of the squash, you can cook it with the skins on. So just do that. And then the second one as well is, to get off the animal-based protein as well. And the third one now that I actually tell a lot of people is, a lot of times if it has like when you're just starting out and it's so complex and, people were taught, read the labels, that's so confusing. So I just say, you know what? Eat food that just doesn't have a label on it for the next little while until you become super savvy, but just don't eat anything with a label. And I mean, when you become savvy, I mean, I'm sure like your son's products at Plant Pure Nation, like obviously it has a label on it, but a lot of people don't know the difference between whole wheat and whole food. And they'll read on the labels. People are so misleading with their marketing that, it traps people in this cycle of eating unhealthy, denatured food that's in a package when they could actually just eat the whole thing and much cheaper too for a lot of people, because they'll say, well, they might not be able to afford Plant Pure Nation food, because they're buying it for a family of 5 and they're on a budget of $50 a month for food. But you know what? You can afford a box of potatoes, right?
Yep.
Or a bag of oatmeal or something like that. And you eat that. And so I think those 3 tips right there are probably your 2 tips. And then,
That's good advice. Yeah, it's a good addition.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that, Dr. Colin Campbell. I know you have so many things to do probably. I mean, you're running the school, and are you still doing a lot of research as well and getting grants for that?
My son is sort of now doing that at the medical school, and for the most part, it takes a little while to get up to speed on that, but he's got 2 studies now that has received IRB approval.
Wow.
And one of them, he always has been recruiting patients, and that's for the breast cancer women. And anxious to see what that'll look like. Doing it really well, doing it formally, professionally, so that the results, however they come out, they'll be published. I'm very partial to that fact.
Yeah.
That we need to do that kind of stuff that gets into the professional literature. Not that I'm a great fan of professional literature, because a lot of stuff, is not worth publishing. Exactly. But, and without it, then it's called anecdotal. And anytime it's anecdotal, it doesn't count. Well, you know the story. So I think it's a good rule to follow.
Yeah, definitely. And, when it comes to studies too, just for the people who are listening, maybe just to finish up and wrap things off, I think we'll probably need to do about 3 more podcasts together, Dr. Campbell, to get all the stories out there and all the questions that I wanted to ask you. But could you just explain to people, because then the other thing that most people say when they're first learning about this is they say, well, send me a study that proves that food is medicine. But I mean, if you can just explain how expensive it is and how hard it is to get funding to conduct a study, and the complications around doing studies around holistic, wholesome, complex nutrition. Maybe just talk to that a little bit, because I think that'll, and maybe instead of asking the question like, well, send me the study, where can they get further information to help them in making that decision?
That is an excellent question. In fact, in the book that I'm just now finishing, that is exactly the topic that I'll discuss in some detail. That perception on the part of many in the public who aren't familiar with scientific ways and means, and they oftentimes think that somehow we just do a study, we get an answer, it's yes or no, end of story. That's not the way science works, as you well know. And so I make the argument that science, in almost every case, it's seldom we can do a single study and get all the answer we need. If we get the answer we need in its completeness, doing a single study, that means we're so reductionist at that point, then the information is likely not to be of interest. It's not likely to work in the long run. So research becomes a series of studies, series of experiments that, and you do an experiment, and it's also a series of questions. Research is not, you make a hypothesis, you do the study, you get an answer. That's not the way science is. Starts out with make a hypothesis, observation, or just make a hypothesis. You can make any hypothesis. We can make any hypotheses we like, however silly they may be. But then the next question, organize an experiment to test to see whether it's true. We get an answer. The answer is always a partial answer at best. We may have to go back and do it a second time to make sure of the results, whatever. But we get an answer. Then we ask the next question. And from that, okay, that's interesting. Now what? And it turns out that in research, it's almost like an endless series of questions. You never get to the final answer. I don't like to say I discovered the absolute truth, because it's only even the best of studies, even done one time, brilliant results. You can't say, oh, I learned the truth. You may have learned a bit of the truth, but it's only part. So the thing is to just keep that in mind. It's a series of questions. And eventually you might reach some places, and sometimes you would do a study along the way that it's marginally significant, or But you're pretty convinced it's probably right because of other information. Well, you have a choice there. You can go back and do it again. You know the details, or you can move on. I think I believe that enough. I'm going to take the next step. And so it becomes a travel. Research is a travel through the forest of mechanisms, a travel through things. And so you get to the other end, you do some more, and then you start knitting together all these results to get a concept of what the whole really means. So that's research. That question you just asked, as I've asked, it really troubles me. I can't believe you just asked that. So I was talking to my wife this morning about that. That is the question that really kind of drives me up the tree.
Yeah. Because
I can't. I said, well, we haven't really done it. You haven't done it. Why are you talking about it? That kind of thing. It's I can understand people, not knowing this kind of information, but it is a difficult question to answer.
It is. And it's expensive to do the research too. Like if you're lucky to find the person who's interested in the subject, then they have to get the funding. And then it's not only that, but even if they do get, these incredible results and they want to publish it, I think one of the stats is like 50% of studies ever get published. Right. And then, and also it's not just about the stuff that's successful. It's about what we learn that also, maybe went against our hypothesis. And that stuff's just as valuable to know as the stuff that comes out in light of your hypothesis. So it is really complex and really challenging for people and people just have to know that sometimes the anecdotal stories are really beneficial as well. When you meet 20 people who said, I changed my diet. Is that your wife back there?
Yes, she was just passed by.
Awesome. But, if you meet 20 people who said, hey, I switched to a whole plant-based diet and I reversed my disease, you might want to just give it a try, so, right, you just have to get out there and try and see if it's going to work for you, because at the end of the day, you're eating food and healthy food and clean food.
My research started out with an anecdotal observation.
What was that?
I was on a golf course in the Philippines. And our job there was to organize a child feeding program, making sure everybody got enough protein. But my golfing partner was my colleague, the medical advisor to the president of the Philippines, actually. He told me on the golf course, he said, hey, you're interested. I just set up a laboratory to explore the cause of liver cancer. He said, you did that. You set up operation on children 4 and under for liver cancer. I said, what? So he told me that. I said, okay, well, I didn't really believe that was true. But then I was also at the same time having this responsibility for the nutrition part of it. Anyhow,
So what was he do? What was he?
So I went back to I put two things together. I noticed in the children, all of a sudden I got the impression, only an impression, totally anecdotal, even weak anecdotal work. It turned out that I got the impression that the children most likely to get liver cancer at that young age were the ones, so happens, they were coming from the few families who were rich enough to buy the animal protein. And so that was it. Now I'm faced with a dilemma. Is it true that animal protein might be related to cancer? Here we're trying to promote animal protein. I'm faced with a proposition. Then I saw a study from India on the experimental animal study that they did, where they got some results just like this. It was an obscure journal. Even the researchers didn't believe it themselves, but it had two pieces of information. One was published, but weak. The researchers didn't believe it. That was totally anecdotal. Those are the two studies that I wrote a grant to NIH for to get money. I got the money. I said, I need to study this question. And I had that grant for the next 27 years.
Wow.
So that's really what started my career.
That is an amazing story. And I think people can learn so much from that.
Just again, it's just, I repeated some of it, just a portion of it, like early cancer. And I got spectacular results. I said, wow. And then I just asked the next question, how does that work? There's this protein, what about that protein? All these kind of things. And I just kept following questions because there are always questions. Always questions. No matter how well the study might have turned out to be, or how big the effect might be, there's another question.
Wow.
First thing, after 15, 20 years, I said, oh my gosh, there's something here. It's like a wave coming at me with a bunch of information.
Yeah.
I better change my own mind. So,
well, the more we learn, the more we discover there's so much that we don't know. And so then the questions stem from that. Yeah.
Excellent.
And I
I'm
just
going
have
to
to
run
say,
one right now, but
what's that?
I said I'm going to have to run now.
Yes, for sure. So Dr. Colin Campbell, it has been such an honor having this discussion with you. Thank you for all of the information that you've provided to our listeners. I mean, there's so many incredible nuggets in here, and any which one of them is going to inspire, I think, just, thousands of people to hopefully go into their kitchen and change the diet. And I'm going to get in touch with your daughter and your son, and we're going to get Dr. Weiss on the podcast, and Dr. Osvald and Dr. Stancic, so many incredible names you've contributed. So thank you so much for your time. I hope we get to do this again in a few months' time, because there's so many more questions now that I have for you naturally. So I appreciate you being on the show.
Thank you. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. And you as well. And you'll let us know when your book is out, because we can't wait to sell that through our restaurants and through all our networks as well.
Thank you very much. Appreciate
Amazing.
it.
Thanks, Dr. T. Colin Campbell. Have an amazing day.
Thank you.
So I hope you enjoyed that podcast with Dr. Campbell. Please write to us if you'd like to have him on the show again. I know that he would be more than willing to continue our discussion around the Gerson therapy, to continue our discussion around how do we advance policy and create change with making this information available to everyone, not just the few people who have taken the time to educate themselves, but how do we bring this education into mainstream medical schools, mainstream universities and colleges, mainstream learning everywhere. And Dr. Colin Campbell is definitely the person to have the answers behind that. So thank you for listening to this podcast. A few end notes is that you still have a few days to register for our program. It's our Nutrition and Detox program. It teaches you how to coach others in using food as medicine to reverse their disease. And this program is based on the Gerson therapy. It is based on the scientific principles behind the Gerson therapy, the art of the Gerson therapy. We teach you how to become a wellness warrior and an advocate by actually having to do the therapy yourself, so you can see the direct effect that doing the therapy has on your health and on your life. And then as well, you go out there and you teach it to 12 other people through 12 case studies. You learn how to do proper research, so really good, efficacious research, and not the kind where you're just reading blogs and looking at people's websites, but where you're actually learning how to decipher the good scientific peer-reviewed journal articles from the other articles that are out there that may even be peer-reviewed, but maybe they're just not designed well, they're biased, and we teach you how to be able to get access to those journal articles, how to read them, interpret them, and how to use them so you can further your learning. You'll be writing a final exam, writing a research paper yourself. It is meant for people who have not been in school for ages. You don't have to have ever even gone to post-secondary school. We are teaching you the things that are just not taught in school. So in addition to writing the exam, writing the research paper, taking the 12 case studies, doing the therapy yourself, you actually get to write a blog so that you can take what you've learned and provide that information to the public. We want you to be able to disseminate the information so that others can learn from you. And lastly, we coach you on how to give a presentation as well, because some people learn by reading, but other people learn by listening. And we hope that our students are going to be asked to speak at conferences. Many of them have. Some of them have started their own businesses. Some of them have created their own coaching programs. Some of them have come to work for us as well. So sign up for that program, nicolettericher.com or richerhealth.ca. You can also find the information on our richerhealthretreatcenter.com website as well. So thanks for staying with us, for listening to this podcast. Write to us, tell us what you think. We're super excited to hear your comments and get your feedback. And please share the Eat Real to Heal podcast with those people that you love in your life, that you want to inspire and motivate to make those changes that are going to bring true health and happiness and vitality to their life. Eat well, eat clean, be well. Bye-bye.